It says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live.' And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, 'If I touch even his garments, I will be made well.' And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned out to the crowd and said, 'Who touched my garments?' And his disciples said to him, 'You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, "Who touched me?"' And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease.' While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, 'Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?' But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, 'Do not fear, only believe.' And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, 'Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping.' And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, 'Talitha kumi,' which means, 'Little girl, I say to you, arise.' And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give us something to eat." The first thing that we see about Jesus in this passage is that he was surrounded by crowds. Crowds thronged about him. He had built himself a reputation as a miracle worker. Just before this story, in the previous chapter, we read the story of the demon-possessed man who was healed. And a great display of power from above occurred in that place, so much that people were afraid and told Jesus to go somewhere else. They couldn't cope with all of that. So people flocked to Jesus, looking for healing, looking for a message, looking for signs. He was a great teacher and had a great following. Wherever he went, people were with him. As soon as he had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Now the thing with Jesus is that all his miracles, if you look at the Gospels and all that he did, all his miracles were aimed at something more than the mere physical sign of healing or restoration that he performed. He healed the sick, he restored sight to the blind, he made the deaf hear, he healed the lame. But all of these signs were meant to point to something spiritual about Jesus's ministry. When John the Baptist inquired about Jesus whilst in prison and asked his disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you the one? Are you the one? Are you the one we've been waiting for? Are you the Messiah?" in other terms. Jesus' response to them was, "The lame walk, the blind see, the deaf hear." Because all of these signs had a spiritual meaning which went beyond the healing itself to point towards something spiritual about Jesus' ministry. His ministry was a ministry of restoration. He was the Messiah who was supposed to lead people back to God, who was providing spiritual healing to those who were spiritually blind, who was providing spiritual ears to those who were spiritually deaf, who was in putting new life in those who were lifeless, who were spiritually dead. So all of these signs were supposed to point people to a deeper meaning, to a deeper reality than simply what met the eye. And he did all of these miracles for at least a double purpose. The purpose of healing the person who came to him in their desperate need, but also, most of all, to make people have faith in God, to make people realize that they were in need of a savior. He was in the heart business, as someone else had put it. He wanted to turn their hearts towards God. That was his main and ultimate goal. It's been a while now that Vicky and I have been watching the Chosen series. I don't know if many of you are familiar with it. I think it's excellent. I can highly recommend it. It's a modern rendition of the Gospels with some dramatization, some creative license there, but very biblically accurate. Now, the team behind this Chosen series has put together some clips which I find really helpful. So we're going to watch a 5-minute clip now, hopefully it'll work, of the account of the healing of the woman with a blood discharge, and we're going to pick from there some elements and some parallels with this passage. What was the big deal about the blood discharge, and why did that make people unclean? We find this explanation in the Old Testament. In Leviticus chapter 15, verses 19 to 30, I'm going to read 2 verses about this, which kind of make the point. It says, when a woman has a discharge, and the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be in a menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of discharge she shall continue uncleanness, and as in the days of her impurity she shall be unclean. In the Old Testament, there were laws about ceremonial impurity and purification, and one of these laws was one that I read. So you can imagine the kind of life that this woman had had. She had been sick for 12 years. She couldn't physically touch anybody, because by touching them, she would make them ceremonially unclean, and that was a big, big, big problem in that culture. It meant they couldn't go to the temple, they couldn't worship God. Anybody else who was touched by a person who was impure got impure in themselves, and therefore it was a circle of isolation. It was almost like she was a leper, right? She was an outcast from society. She couldn't have any social relationships with people. She had spent most of her money, all of her money, trying to look for a cure, and hadn't found it. She had got worse, in fact, the passage says. So she was in a desperate need for somebody to heal her. And she had heard that Jesus was a miraculous healer, and had gone there in the faith that maybe if I just touch his robe, I'll be clean. She wasn't selfish enough to say, I'm just going to touch him, I don't care. She was, even in her need, she thought, I won't touch him, I won't make him unclean, I'll just touch his robes, that'll be enough. I'll be healed like that. So she came to Jesus in dire need. If we continue to read in the Old Testament, we're also taught about uncleanliness in touching a dead body, a corpse. It says in Numbers 19:11 to 22, I'm going to read 2 verses again. It says, whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean 7 days. He shall cleanse himself with the water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and so be clean. But if he does not cleanse himself on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, he will not become clean. Went too far ahead. Sorry. There was uncleanness associated with the act of touching a dead body. Jairus, the little girl's father, was asking Jesus to touch her girl. That act would have made Jesus unclean. in the same way that touching the unclean woman would have made him unclean. We see starting to see some parallels between these stories. There were two women, one younger, one older. They were both desperate, and helping them would have made Jesus ceremonially unclean according to their law. And this is the first point that I want us to reflect on. Jesus meets people where they are. You see, the woman with the blood discharge, had faith. If I touch Jesus' clothes, I'll be healed. Jairus had faith. He thought, if Jesus touches my daughter with his hands, she'll be healed. The Roman soldier, in another gospel, if you remember, he had more faith. He thought, if Jesus says the word, my servant will be healed. Now, all these three people, and there are many others in the gospels, but let's focus on these three. All these three people had faith that Jesus was going to help them if they did something. And Jesus didn't ask them to do the same thing, all three. Okay? Jesus met them where they were in their journey of faith. He met the woman according to her faith by healing her after she touched his clothes. He met Jairus in his faith by going with him and putting his hands on his daughter. He met the Roman soldier according to his faith by saying the word, just like he had asked, and the healing took place. And this teaches me that God treats each of us personally, individually, and uniquely according to where we are in our journey of faith. He doesn't require us to fulfill a list of mandatory requirements to be helped by him. He meets us where we are, with as much or as little faith that we have, but he's always happy to help. He never says no. He meets people where they are, and he has compassion for them all. So if you don't think you have enough faith, or you don't have the faith it takes for you to see wonders in your life, well, join the long queue of people who have thought the same. And none of them went away disappointed by God. God can meet you where you are. And he can help you. He's the one who can. Another thing is that Jesus didn't mind being interrupted. Jesus was on his way to help a little girl who was about to die. Her father Jairus was most nervous because he didn't think he would have made it on time. Yet Jesus stops everything. Stops right on his track. Stops everybody who was following him and says, "Who touched me?" Quite an odd question to ask. He felt that power had gone out of him and something truly miraculous and powerful had taken place. And he didn't mind being interrupted. And I thought about myself and how task-focused I tend to be, and how annoyed I tend to be when I am on a mission and someone interrupts me. Even if I'm trying to explain something and I get interrupted, I get annoyed with the person who interrupted. It isn't like that. He didn't mind being interrupted. He always had time. He always made space in his heart for those who were in need. He stopped everything because he knew that there was a woman in need who needed help, who needed his help, who'd waited 12 long years and lived with that pain. And he stopped everything to help her. You see, God always has time to listen to you. You must never be worried about bothering God with your requests. must never be worried you're wasting his time, because he's always available. He works all the time, in every place, in every hour of the day. He makes time for you. And he doesn't mind being interrupted to help. He has infinite resources. And he's the one who can help you. Unlike a human, he doesn't have finite resources. He's loving and compassionate and kind. And he loves you. And then we see the element of a loving father. We see that the woman didn't have a caring father near her to care for her needs. We don't know what happened to her father, but most likely, making an informed guess, due to her condition, she had been alienated by her family. They couldn't take care of her. She was by herself. As the dramatized story in The Chosen points out, she didn't feel like she was anybody's daughter anymore. She was alone, and she was in desperate need. On the other side, we see the little girl who has a loving father, Jairus. Jairus is a loving father who is helpless. He can't help his daughter. So he goes to the best person he knows who can help her, who is Jesus. Because of his faith, that he could heal this girl. So he, as a loving father, as a caring father, intercedes for his daughter with Jesus. And Jesus calls the woman who was healed, daughter. Daughter. I'm sure that meant a lot to her. She was a daughter. She had a father. She had a loving father who, unlike Jairus, was helpless to help his daughter. This loving father could help this woman. So what Jesus does and what he displays in healing her is that there is a loving father, even for the fatherless, even for those who don't have loving fathers. I don't know what your experience has been with your father, but I know that many people have mixed experiences. Some people have good fathers. Some people have bad fathers. Some people have never known their father. Despite where you are and who your father is, there is a loving father. And you're a son. And you're a daughter to him. In Jairus, we see a type of Jesus because he intercedes with God for the healing of his daughter. Jesus intercedes with the Father for the healing of the woman. He is the loving Father. He is the loving Father that the woman desperately needed. They had different social standings, these two women, but they had the same desperation. So they go to God in their need. There was a time in my life in which I felt quite helpless. Well, there have been many. But I thought of telling you this story in illustration of this concept. About 12 years ago, more or less, Vicky and I were living in Italy, and we were visiting some friends of ours in Abruzzo, which is about 5 hours drive from where we used to live. A missionary couple, lovely family. It so happened that it was during Easter time, Sebastian started to have a severe pain in his belly. And we weren't sure where it was, but it was a very severe pain. So we took him to A&E to have him checked. And when we took him to A&E, they said that he had appendicitis. And he needed to be urgently operated. And this came as a big surprise, and we were so concerned. Sebastian was in great pain. Love him, he was so young. There was no option to take him home to the hospital near our house. We were too far away. So they decided to operate on him then. So they operated on him. They were afraid that his appendix had burst, so they had to cut instead of just removing it with the less invasive way. So it was a delicate operation. It all went well, and the only thing is, because of the cut, Sebastian was in pain afterwards and had to stay in hospital for 2 days. And the first night, I stayed with him the night in the hospital. And we arranged it that Vicky was going to stay with these friends of ours for the week until Sebastian recovered, but I had to go back to work the following day. So I spent the night with Sebastian in the hospital. And Sebastian was in pain, but he was so young, they couldn't give him any painkillers because he couldn't have handled them. So they just gave him paracetamol, and he had to cope with the pain. And I was there by his bed, seeing Sebastian obviously in pain, complaining about the pain, and there was nothing I could do. I called the nurse a few times. The nurse told me, sorry, we can't give him any more medicine. He'll just have to get through it. And I felt really helpless. I didn't know what to do, and it was painful. I don't know if you've ever been through something like this, but with children, if you have a son or a daughter who is suffering and you can't do anything to help them, I really felt the pain. And there was a time in which I wished to take the pain away, so that he wouldn't have to have it, and I would have it in his place. And obviously I couldn't do that. But it made me think about God then, and it was a precious lesson for me. I was reminded of the fact that God did that for us. God did that for me. God did take our pain and bore it, so that we wouldn't have to carry our pain. He took our pain so that we wouldn't have to carry our pain and live with it. He paid on the cross for our sin. It wasn't his sin. It was our sin he paid for on the cross, so that we could go free. He did that for us. And in that moment of pain, I was encouraged by the memory of a God who has taken our pain on himself. And he's the only one who truly can. He is a loving Father. He's not a helpless Father. He's a powerful Father who can make all the difference in the world if you put your faith in him. And then we see this element, number 12. If you pay attention, the woman had suffered for 12 years with her condition. She had been sick for 12 years. But the little girl was 12 years old. And what does the number 12 mean in the Bible? Pardon? I thought someone said something. It means Israel. It's a symbol that refers to Israel, 12. The 12 tribes of Israel. In choosing to do this miracle, and Mark in choosing to intertwine these two stories and tell them together as one, he has a mission in mind there. There's a lesson to be learned there for the people of Israel. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 years of pain, 12 years of life that was ending prematurely. Both women get restored to life in their community by the power of God. I believe that God, through Jesus, was trying to teach Israel that they were spiritually dead and that they needed a savior, just like the little girl. That they had an incurable disease which was leading them to their death, and they needed healing. And God was there, available to help them. If they could only see, if they could only have faith in God, just like Jairus' father had had faith, just like the poor woman had faith. If only they had had faith in Jesus and acknowledged him as the Son of God, as their Messiah, he could save them. So 12 years has a deeper meaning. Paul in Ephesians says, "You were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ." Humankind is in spiritual lifelessness state. We are dead spiritually unless God puts in us new life through the Spirit, which comes to those who put their faith in Jesus. It takes being born again to be a Christian, speaking through Jesus' words. It takes a new life, supernatural life, spiritual life given by God to be alive. And the comparison with what follows to what came before is the same as the comparison between life and death. We were dead in the trespasses and sins, and Israel was dead in the trespasses and sins, and Jesus was there to save them. And then we see fear. It says, "The woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And Jairus, soon after, overhearing what they said, Jesus says to the ruler of the synagogue, 'Do not fear, only believe.'" Do not fear. Do not fear. God is telling us, do not fear. Do not fear, son. Do not fear, daughter. I got this. I got this. Do not fear whatever happens to you in your life. I got this. I'm your God. You're my son. You're my daughter. You'll be with me forever. Do not fear. He says do not fear to several people. God says do not fear to several people in the Bible, in the Old Testament as well. You'll remember Joshua comes to mind now. There are many others whom God told to not have fear, to have faith instead. Faith replaces fear. And we're called to do the same. We're called to have faith instead of fear. Faith in God defeats fear from the circumstances. Only believe. And then he brings the dead to life. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. And to the little girl he said, I say to you, arise. And as I said before, our spiritual condition is lifelessness. In the same way that the woman with the blood discharge was considered impure, the corpse was considered impure, yet Jesus touched her. He put his hand on her. And that didn't make Jesus impure. Because the fullness of God's Spirit dwelt in him. He was God incarnate, God made man. And he had the compassion and the love to touch these people. It doesn't say in the Bible that Jesus touched the woman with the blood discharge, but I truly believe that he did touch her to communicate love from God to her. And it's important. We as human beings crave touch to communicate with one another, to communicate love to one another. Jesus did that with these two people. And he wasn't afraid of being impure. God wasn't afraid of becoming impure by becoming a human. God gave all that he could give so that we could have a way to know him and be healed by him. He became one of us. He didn't sin like we do, but he became one of us to teach us how to live our lives, and how to be compassionate as he is. And I'm going to close with this. It says in one of the favorite passages in the Bible for me, Isaiah 55, "Come everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and you labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen diligently to me and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in rich food. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live." And Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus' call to us all, to the world, is come to me. Come to me for food. Come to me for happiness. Come to me for water. Don't look for it elsewhere. Because whatever you find isn't going to satisfy your need. We were made by God, for God. And God provided us a way to know him and to be with him. Despite our sinful nature, despite our weaknesses, wherever we are in our journey, he's there. He's there to help us. He's there to lead us back home. And that's what he wants to do with us. So let's go to Jesus with our burdens and trust him to carry them for us. Let's pray.